Hunters, please use caution when hunting pedestrians using walk trails. Oh, boy syrup. Made fresh in store. A misplaced or absent punctuation mark can lead to hilarity, but at its worst, it can cost you millions, or it can even cost you your life. So let's explore some of the worst uses and misuses of punctuation from history. Welcome to another RobWords. This is the state funeral in Ireland of Sir Roger Casement in 1965. However, by this point, the hero of the Irish nationalist movement had already been dead for almost 50 years. In the meantime, his remains had been languishing in the grounds of a prison in London, where half a century earlier, he'd been executed for treason. The story of Roger Casement's death is the right place to begin a video about the power of punctuation, because he has gone down in history as the man who was hanged by a comma. Casement's trial in 1916, in the thick of the First World War, was big news either side of the Irish Sea. Sir Roger had been arrested by the Royal Irish Constabulary after travelling by German U-boat to Ireland and was taken to the Tower of London. Remember, Ireland hadn't yet achieved independence from Britain at this point. He stood accused of trying to recruit Irish prisoners of war in Germany to the independence movement in Ireland, and of procuring weapons from the Germans to use against the British. There was zero doubt that Sir Roger had done what he was accused of. The playwright George Bernard Shaw, a fellow Irishman and fan of the Republican, wrote supportive letters to Casement as he was awaiting trial, but later also wrote that the facts were undeniable. Instead, his defence team was hoping to keep him from the gallows by contesting a point of law. This is where the fateful comma comes in. Sir Roger was being tried under the 1351 Treason Act, a piece of legislation that was already over half a millennium old. And it said a treasonable offence was committed if a man do levy war against our Lord the King in his realm, or be adherent to the King's enemies in his realm, giving to them aid and comfort in the realm or elsewhere, ... We can stop there, because there it is, the comma upon which Casement's life supposedly hung, right near the end, just before or elsewhere. The sentence, or rather fragment of a sentence, is hideous, isn't it? It is ambiguous, and in such a way that makes what Roger Casement did either treason or not treason. His defence argued that this described two possible treasonable acts. One, levying war against our Lord the King in his realm, and two, adhering to the King's enemies in his realm. That bit about giving to them aid and comfort in the realm or elsewhere was simply just a clarification of what adhering meant, helping the King's enemies, whether those enemies were in Britain or abroad. Now, under this interpretation, for the act to be treason, the traitor would have to be acting within the King's realm, i.e. on British soil. However, Roger had done the acts he was accused of while in Germany. Therefore, not treason. It'd basically make him a prisoner of war or enemy agent rather than a traitor. The prosecution, of course, had other ideas. They argued that the or elsewhere, separated off by a comma, in fact referred to where the adhering to the King's enemies had taken place. It was treason if the adherence had happened in this realm or elsewhere. It's tough, I know, but if you're lost, to be honest, it's not a big deal. The point is, read the sentence one way and Sir Roger is not a traitor. Read it another and he's guilty as sin. And the comma is a big part of that ambiguity. Take it away and the defence has a stronger case. Leave it in and the law remains confusing. So where's the argument? The comma is there. We're looking right at it, aren't we? Well, yes, we are, but just have a look at the other side of this document. This is exactly the same text, but in a different language. How's your French? Well, it doesn't really matter, because this is 14th century Anglo-Norman French, which is rather different to the French spoken today. Nevertheless, I'm confident that this is the equivalent bit. And do you notice anything about this bit of text? no commas at all. And definitely not before the ou ailleurs, which means or elsewhere. Does this matter? Well, yeah, because this is the original version of the law. The English translation comes later and might not be an accurate interpretation of it. Someone just decided to put those commas in. In the end, the judge sided with the prosecution. His activities, even though they were in Germany, were treason. After being found guilty, Casement wrote, "God deliver from such antiquaries as these, to hang a man's life upon a comma and throttle him with a semicolon." Dramatic. Casement was stripped of his knighthood, earned from the king just 5 years earlier, for highlighting atrocities against indigenous people in the Belgian Congo and Peru. He was an impressive fella who despised colonialism in all its forms. And he was sentenced to death. In the century since he was hanged, the importance of the comma in his case has become somewhat inflated, I think it's fair to say. Sir Roger was doomed as soon as he entered the dock, with the British acting as both the victim and the judge, jury and executioner in the case. What's more, the discovery of his diaries at that time revealed that Sir Roger was gay, a serious crime all of its own back then. He died a martyr to the Irish cause, and 50 years later his remains returned to Ireland, where he received that state funeral. And he's remembered there as a hero of the Republican movement. Next, we're going to explore what happens when punctuation meets piracy. But first, let's see how many punctuation marks I can get into this next bit. When you dash away on holiday, any websites you visit know that you're in another country. This can make accessing some of the content you're used to a bit of a catapostrophe. However, you can surf the net like you're still at home using this video's sponsor, NordVPN. NordVPN enables you to change your online location, meaning you can say goodbye geo-blocked content and hi phenomenally good access to media from around the world. But that's not all. Disguising your IP also protects you on public Wi-Fi, bringing online snoopers hoping to access your data to a full stop. And NordVPN is much more than just a VPN. It helps you move your internet security forward, slashing your chances of falling victim to cyber criminals using its threat protection feature. It helps you effortlessly dodge any dirty tricks by online mob brackets by scanning any downloaded files for malware, directing you away from websites known for scamming people, and blocking irritating or harmful pop-ups. I have NordVPN switched on all the time, and I can protect my whole family from head to colon by having it on up to 10 devices. Don't leave a question mark over your cyber security. Use my special link or go to nordvpn.com/RobWords VPN. That's nordvpn.com/RobWords VPN to get an exclusive deal with 4 extra months on top. There is a 30-day money-back guarantee, so why not try it for a period? Now, in 1818, the US Supreme Court was faced with a quandary, as it so often is. In the case of United States versus Palmer et al., it had to decide whether 3 men, John Palmer, Thomas Wilson and Barney Callahan, were pirates.
Shiver me timbers.
The court set out the facts in typically impenetrable legal prose. The 3 men did piratically and feloniously set upon, board, break and enter a certain ship called the Industria Rafaeli. It was a Spanish ship. They then piratically and feloniously did various other nasty things before making off with thousands of dollars worth of sugar, rum, honey, hides, coffee, silver and gold. Now that sounds pretty piratey to me, but was it in the eyes of US law? That's what the Supreme Court had to decide, and it mattered because piracy was a crime punishable by death. But the law was so unclear that it prompted the judge to say it really is the fact in this case that these men's lives may depend upon a comma. Here's the statute, and it is rammed full of the things, comma after comma after comma, and they're positioned in such a way as to create 2 perfectly reasonable, very different interpretations. It's basically saying that certain crimes, if they carried the death penalty on land, should be considered piracy on the high seas, and therefore also receive the death penalty. But the controversy surrounds this bit here. The glut of commas makes it impossible to know whether this caveat applies to just this bit or to all of this bit. And that's a disaster, because one of those interpretations makes all robbery on the high seas piracy, but the other makes only the kind of robbery that could get you sentenced to death on land piracy. If the latter is the correct interpretation, the three fellas walk away with their lives.
Huzzah!
But the Supreme Court decided that it wasn't. Robbery on the high seas did count as piracy, whether it would be a capital offence in the US or not. Are the three men pirates? Yes, they are. And yet, the trio walked free. While the Supreme Court agreed that what they did was piracy, it also ruled that the US had no business prosecuting them when the crime committed had been against a foreign ship and they'd been commissioned to rob it, it turned out, by a foreign government. The three would-be pirates lived to plunder another day. Next, can I show you what is easily my favourite deployment of punctuation of all time? Because it occurs just 30 years after that piratical punctuational escapade. It's in this 1848 book, A Pickle for the Knowing Ones. It was written by a, let's say, quirky fella called Timothy Dexter, an American businessman whose successes are generally attributed to luck rather than skill. In this book, he tells the story of his life in breathless fashion. So breathless, in fact, that there is not a single use of punctuation. His sentences are technically endless. However, at the very end of the book, he appended this page, a leaf filled with commas, colons, semicolons, etc., all of which come with no explanation. Not in this edition anyway. In an older edition, Lord Dexter did include a small note for the printer about this weird collection of marks. The knowing ones, by which he means normal intelligent people, complained of my book. The first edition had no stops. I put in enough here and they may pepper and salt it as they please. So what he's saying is, you don't like the lack of punctuation? Here, choose your own. What a guy. Now, so far in this video, we've seen how sloppy punctuation can cost lives, but it can also cost you an awful lot of money. In 1872, the US Congress published its riveting-sounding Tariff Act of 1872. It set out what duties importers of all manner of goods would have to pay to get those goods into the United States. However, it also included a free list which described which goods were not subject to tariffs, i.e., they were free to import. On that list was written this: fruits, plants, tropical and semi-tropical, for the purposes of propagation or cultivation. So it's reasonably clear, isn't it? There's a bit of ambiguity over whether the tropical and semi-tropical refers to just the plants or to the fruits and the plants, and it's a bit clunky to read, but what is clear is that we're dealing with two types of goods, aren't we? Fruits and plants. Simple, except this contains a rather unfortunate printing error. Congress had in fact intended for the statute to contain an exemption for fruit plants, tropical and semi-tropical, for the purposes of propagation and cultivation. Uh-oh. There's quite a difference between these two, isn't there? One allows just plants, and the other allows fruit and plants. At the time, the publishers responsible for this error were humiliated in the press. The New York Times pointed out, firstly, that the S on fruits shouldn't be there, and that secondly, the hyphen after fruit had been idiotically converted to a comma. The Times then dramatically declared, "Here we have it, the intention of Congress depending on a punctuation mark." It witheringly added, "Such loose and slipshod legislation by persons pretending to understand the English language is disgraceful." Importers, of course, took advantage of the loophole created by the comma that should have been a hyphen, and before it was closed, it's since been estimated the mistake cost US taxpayers $2 million in unpaid revenue. That's the equivalent of today, $40 million. Ouch. That is one costly comma, but not the only one witnessed in the United States. Let's move forward in time, quite a long way actually, to less than a decade ago, to 2017, and to a hearing where the first words out of the judge's mouth were, "For want of a comma, we have this case." Do you know what an Oxford comma is? It's sometimes also called a serial comma, and it's the comma that appears just before and or in a list, like blood, toil, tears, and sweat from the famous Winston Churchill quote. That final comma is essentially optional. Actually, despite the name Oxford comma, it's less likely to be used in the UK than it is in the United States. In fact, the official transcript of that Churchill quote doesn't actually have one. I cheated. Optional or not, without doubt the serial comma can help avoid certain ambiguities. Take this sentence, for example. Meet my parents, Barney the dinosaur, and Shrek. The serial comma makes clear that we're meeting 4 people. My parents,
Hello.
Barney,
Hi, Rob.
and Shrek.
Donkey.
Leave the comma off, and it appears to reveal that I am the offspring of Dino and Ogre,
We love Rob.
which I'm not. And just such an ambiguity is responsible for the case before the Court of Appeals in 2017. Delivery drivers for Oakhurst Dairy argued that, despite their employer's insistence, their work should be eligible for overtime pay. They pointed to a section of the law in the state of Maine that provided that only the following activities should be exempt from overtime: the canning, processing, preserving, freezing, drying, marketing, storing, packing for shipment or distribution of agricultural produce, meat and fish products, and perishable foods. The dairy delivery drivers insisted that they didn't do any of these things, so must therefore be eligible for juicy overtime pay. However, Oakhurst disagreed, saying the drivers were very clearly responsible for the distribution of perishable foods. Now, can you see what's happening here? The drivers and dairy are in disagreement over one specific bit of this sentence. So Oakhurst is saying that distribution is one of the items on the list. However, the drivers are claiming that it isn't, but rather packing for shipment or distribution is a single task, a task that they do not perform. They're drivers, not packers. Initially, the district court sided with the dairy, saying the law clearly exempted distribution of perishable foods from overtime protection. But the circuit judge at the Court of Appeals thought otherwise, saying if that exemption used a serial comma, i.e. the Oxford comma, to mark off the last of the activities that it lists, then the exemption would clearly encompass an activity that the drivers perform. However, the law contained no such comma, and thus the judge adopted the driver's narrower reading of the exemption and reversed the previous judgment. The drivers won the case, and it was reportedly settled for $5 million. Looking at the legislation in Maine now, you can see that they've fixed the law, opting to go belt and braces by using semicolons to separate up the list. You can also see that ultimately the dairy's interpretation was the correct one. The comma is not the only punctuation mark whose addition or omission has had oversized consequences. One of the marvellous things about English is that with a single squiggle and a dot, we can transform a statement into a question. For example, "You ate my hamster." Statement: "You ate my hamster?" Question, to which the answer is hopefully no. A mere question mark can turn the certain into the uncertain. And there is a marvellous historical example in which this punctuation superpower was used to ridiculous effect. In 1916, while Britain was bogged down in the First World War and executing Irish heroes, the USA, which was yet to join the war, was holding a presidential election. Incumbent Democratic President Woodrow Wilson faced Republican challenger Charles Evans Hughes. Now, it had been almost a century since a Democrat incumbent had won a second term, and as the results came in, it became apparent that Woodrow Wilson wasn't about to buck that trend. Hughes looked on course for victory, and so confident were some newspaper editors that the Republican had won that they put their papers to bed that very night with headlines declaring that he had done. Supposedly among the papers to do this was New York's The Evening World. I couldn't actually find the front page in question. It appears to have been expunged from the record for reasons that will become apparent. But according to accounts from the time, The Evening World initially went with the headline, "Hughes elected in close contest." President-elect Charles Hughes must have gone to bed on election night pleased as punch. Victory was assured. However, the journalist Walter Millis later wrote about what happened next. When Mr. Hughes awoke that morning, his photograph was still resplendent upon the front pages of the late editions. The World's banner headline stood as before, save the addition of one small punctuation mark. It now read, "Hughes elected in close contest?" The element of doubt injected by the question mark was well-founded. Hughes had in fact lost, as the Library of Congress's archived edition of the New York World shows. They did eventually get it right, although they were still hedging their bets with probably. That whole incident must have been absolutely gutting for almost President Hughes, but at least that punctuation mark didn't cost anyone their lives or anyone millions of dollars. And in that spirit of frivolity, let's look at a few more of some of the sillier punctuation errors that the internet has to offer. I'm a big fan of this Reddit called Suspicious Quotes, which charts all manner of bonkers use of quotation marks. Usually what's happened is someone has used them for emphasis, which is not what they are for. For example, if you drop a cup on the floor, please pick it up. What is cup code for here? What is the actual name of this hotel if it's not actually Aragon? What meat is this if it's not actually pork? And unless this is really a front for some sort of laundering, get rid of the quotation marks. And from the Punctuation Kills Reddit, this meme always serves as food for thought, stressing the difference between congrats on your baby, congrats on your baby, and congrats on your baby. Yeah, punctuation matters. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, I reckon you'll like this one too. Oh, and if you happen to be in London on the 11th of April and at a loose end, I'm doing 2 live shows at the Bloomsbury Theatre. Come and see me. I'll leave a link to tickets below. You could also check out my free newsletter. Until next time, take care.